So we're on the ninth lesson on comprehension. So what can I comprehend about what you were comprehending about comprehension? Please, just the main points on comprehension.
I love that statement. Now, really, it's critical that we understand the difference between the covenant given on Mount Sinai and the new covenant in Christ. Paul said in Galatians, and I'm just going to read it to you really quick. He says in verse 10 of Galatians chapter 3, "For as many of you as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. But that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident. For the just shall live by faith, yet the law is not of faith, but the man who does them shall live by them." In other words, and I'm going to pick back up in that scripture, the law was meant to be interpreted as a whole, one entire unit. Moral commandments, ritual commandments, all of it put together. It wasn't based on faith, it was based on works. The man who does them shall be justified. Problem is, nobody does them. And the penalties, we try to differentiate between moral laws and ritual laws. The problem is that if penalties for breaking laws is any indicator of how severe they were to God, ritual laws, breaking those were oftentimes just as bad as breaking a moral law like murder. The penalty for murder was death. The penalty for Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus for offering profane fire on at the tabernacle, strange fire, was punishable by death as well. And so it's meant to be interpreted as a whole unit. Okay, and so if you think that the new covenant is trying to teach us how to do the old covenant better, you've missed it. Because you're going to go right back to works. You're going to go right back. It's not that the things in the law are bad, the moral things. It's not like you can go murder now in the new covenant, but you can't read that too much into it. And I'll tell you another reason that the author of Hebrews tells us. This is why you have to understand the difference, because one is in effect, there's only one covenant through which you can have intimacy and relationship with God, and that's the new covenant. And I say that because the author of Hebrews in chapter 8 says this in verse 13 to close the chapter. He said, "In that he says a new covenant, he has made the first," talking about the covenant on Mount Sinai, if you read the context, "he has made the first obsolete." Now, what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Writing to Christian Jews who had a hard time leaving the synagogue and the temple to come to the church, which is why he says, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, had a hard time switching from old to new covenant, from the Aaronic priesthood to Christ as the new high priest, the better high priest. He was telling them that right there, that the old covenant is vanishing away and obsolete. Why? Because it never accomplished holiness. It never got us to the end goal that the old covenant never got us to the end goal that the new does, and that end goal is Christ-likeness, holiness, righteousness, that righteous character we just talked about in the last lesson. It's only accomplished if God's working that in you and through you. And so it's very hard to understand, but Paul, after what we just read in Galatians 10 through 12, talks about what the law entails, and then he tells us in verse 13, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles in Jesus Christ, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. The promise of the Spirit is the promise that God will work in you that holy character. The promise that God will be one with you and help you and accomplish that work in you. If we resort to the old covenant for that, it never is accomplished. It never happens. We never reach the end goal. We never become like Christ, like the son or daughter of God we're meant to be. Only in the new covenant we get that. And so comprehending the difference between the two, it's not that they're disconnected. They're very much connected, but they are different in the very means through which they make you different.
Is there a danger if I don't understand it in the correct way?
There is, because you'll still be stuck trying to work out your own salvation. A lot of people think or say that doesn't happen. It really does. It really does, because we're always self-criticizing. We're always, oh, it's a failure. It's meant to help you fail, actually, in a sense, the law, to show you your unrighteousness. Which kind of why you had sacrifices every day. It's kind of why people were continually stuck in their sins. The New Testament, especially Pauline's epistles, or the Pauline epistles, this book really helps you understand that,
Right.
and helps you interpret this New Testament and what it's actually saying. And so, especially to people who have been very, very influenced by the law, by the Old Testament, and have focused more on that, the book of Hebrews is perfect, because the author of Hebrews was writing to people like that and showing them you have a better covenant, you have a new thing.
Right.
And it's not because the old was bad, it just didn't accomplish the goal.
Right.
Okay? And so that's why it's critical. It's so critical, because the real change can't really occur until you really embrace the new covenant.
So you got to understand the deal, right?
You got to get the deal right.
And how does this translate to marriage?
Well, it translates a lot. You have to know how to have a successful marriage, right? You have to understand what those vows really represent, right? You have to understand what a marriage covenant is. If you're gonna,
It really means sickness to death?
it really means all that.
Kidding.
If you're not going in it with your eyes open and recognizing what the marriage is,
Right.
you're gonna have a big shock in a couple years or a couple months when it all hits home, and it's the glimmer and the gold is kind of worn off, and it's becoming monotonous, and you're used to the same person a lot. You gotta really get what it means. It's commitment. It's working together. It's oneness.
Right. Again, a great deal. So,
One more thing on that, Kirk.
Yes.
Just a picture. Think about in the Old Covenant tabernacle how people could never come into God's presence. There was a veil.
Right.
And how after Christ was crucified in Matthew, it shows the veil was torn and now you can come into His presence. You can't enter into a marriage covenant unless you are one. You couldn't be one with God in the Old Covenant. You were separated by a veil.
Right.
In the New Covenant, you can be one. That veil is torn.
and take it away.
That's the best way to connect it to marriage, I think.
And now we're seeing openly what is behind the veil type thing. So that's